Nobody on that plane expected drama in first class. It was supposed to be a routine boarding process. Business travelers settling in, flight attendants preparing champagne, quiet murmurs of conversation filling the luxurious first-class cabin. And then he walked in. A well-dressed man in his mid-50s, wearing an expensive tailored suit, exuding arrogance with every step. His Rolex flashed under the overhead lights, his cologne strong enough to make his presence known before he even spoke. He had flown first class more times than he could count, and he was used to being the most important person on the plane. That's why, when he saw someone sitting in his seat, his smirk immediately faded. Seat 1A, the most prestigious seat on the aircraft, the one he had booked months in advance. But now a young blonde woman was comfortably sitting there, already buckled in. His nostrils flared. The flight attendant gave him a polite nod. "Welcome aboard, Mr. Crawford." Crawford didn't even acknowledge her. His focus was locked onto the woman in his seat. She was dressed elegantly but professionally. A fitted blazer over a light blouse, perfectly pressed slacks, a simple but expensive-looking necklace. Her long blonde hair rested effortlessly over her shoulders, and her posture was poised yet completely relaxed. She wasn't stressed. She wasn't panicked. She was calm. That irritated him even more. "Excuse me," Crawford said loudly, making sure half the row could hear. "I think you're in the wrong seat." The woman looked up. Her eyes met his without a hint of concern. She glanced at her boarding pass, then back at him. "No," she said simply. "I'm in 1A." Crawford let out a mocking laugh, shaking his head as if he had just heard the most ridiculous thing imaginable. "Oh, sweetheart," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "You must be confused. That's my seat." A few passengers glanced over now. The woman didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly lifted her boarding pass and extended it toward him. "First class, seat 1A, she repeated, her voice steady and clear. Crawford snatched the ticket from her hand, his eyes narrowing as he read the name printed on it. Then his smirk returned. "Oh," he said, dragging out the syllable, as if everything suddenly made sense. "I get it now. You must have been upgraded." The way he said it, "you," like she didn't belong, like she was an intruder in first class. The woman still didn't react. She just watched him. Crawford turned to the flight attendant, smirking. "There's clearly been a mistake. I fly this route all the time. I booked one 8 weeks ago." The flight attendant hesitated, looking between the two passengers. "Sir, let me just double-check." "There's nothing to check," Crawford interrupted with a scoff. He gestured toward the woman like she was a child who had wandered into the wrong room. "Look, I don't mean to be rude, but she's probably never even flown first class before." The passengers shifted in their seats. The tension was thick now. Still, the woman remained perfectly calm. Crawford, sensing no immediate reaction, leaned in slightly. His smirk grew. "This must be a special day for you, huh?" He gave her a patronizing grin. "Did someone surprise you with an upgrade? Maybe a rich boyfriend treating you to first class?" A few people audibly gasped. Still, the woman didn't flinch. She simply glanced at the flight attendant, her voice polite but firm. "Could you inform Mr. Crawford that this is my reserved seat?" The flight attendant swallowed hard. "Sir, Ms. Leavitt is correct. This is her seat." The moment froze. Several passengers straightened, because now people were recognizing the name. Karoline Leavitt, the current White House press secretary, a powerful, high-profile figure, and absolutely not someone to underestimate. Crawford's smirk disappeared instantly. The realization hit him like a truck. This wasn't some random young woman who lucked into an upgrade. This was a top government official, and he had just humiliated himself in front of an entire first-class cabin. A few passengers were now whispering to each other. Someone a few rows back chuckled under their breath. Karoline gave him a polite smile. "Still think I don't belong here?" Crawford's face turned red. He opened his mouth trying to salvage his dignity, but nothing came out. For the first time in his very privileged life, he was at a complete loss for words. The flight attendant, sensing the awkwardness, quickly stepped in. "Sir, your seat is 1B, right across the aisle." Crawford's fist clenched slightly. His jaw was so tight it looked painful. For a moment it looked like he was going to argue again. But then, without another word, he dropped into his seat. defeated. The flight attendant handed Karoline back her boarding pass. "Apologies for the misunderstanding, Ms. Leavitt." She took it gracefully, still smiling. She had barely said anything, yet she had completely destroyed him. As the last of the passengers boarded, Crawford stared straight ahead, refusing to even glance in her direction. Karoline. She simply leaned back, adjusted her seatbelt, and enjoyed the moment. Because he knew, and everyone on that plane knew, he had just made the worst mistake of his day. Crawford sat stiffly in 1B, his jaw clenched, his grip tight around the armrest. He kept his eyes forward, refusing to look to his left, where Karoline Leavitt sat comfortably in 1A, her posture relaxed, her expression unbothered. He had just been humiliated in front of the entire first-class cabin, and the worst part? She hadn't even raised her voice. She hadn't insulted him. She hadn't argued. She had let him destroy himself. And now he had no choice but to sit next to her for the entire flight. The flight attendant approached. "Would you like a drink before takeoff, Mr. Crawford?" He exhaled sharply, his voice clipped. "Whiskey? Neat." There was a faint chuckle from across the aisle. Crawford's grip tightened. He didn't turn to see who it was, but he knew. They were still thinking about what had happened. "And for you, Ms. Leavitt?" Karoline smiled politely. "Just sparkling water, thank you." Her voice was light, at ease, like she was enjoying herself while Crawford sat there seething. She hadn't done anything to him, yet he felt like he had lost something. The plane continued boarding, the last of the passengers finding their seats. Crawford shifted, tugging at his cufflink, stealing a glance at the woman next to him. She was younger than him by at least 20 years, yet completely unaffected by the situation. She wasn't flustered, wasn't embarrassed. That only made it worse. He cleared his throat, speaking low. "So, you're the White House press secretary, huh?" Karoline, without even looking at him, nodded. "That's right." Crawford scoffed under his breath. "Not exactly the most challenging job, is it?" Karoline finally glanced at him. Her expression was unreadable, but there was something in her eyes. Amusement, maybe? Like she had already anticipated this exact conversation. Crawford took her silence as an opportunity. "I mean, come on," he continued, leaning in slightly, his tone casual but condescending. "It's just standing at a podium and reading off a script, answering a few softball questions, making sure the cameras get a good shot." He smirked. "You don't actually make any real decisions, do you?" Karoline closed the menu she had been glancing at and set it down. She turned toward him fully, resting her elbow on the shared armrest. "Do you own a business, Mr. Crawford?" she asked, her tone polite. The question caught him off guard. He blinked. "Excuse me?" "A business," she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "Do you own one?" His smirk returned. Finally, he had the upper hand again. "As a matter of fact, I do," he said, puffing his chest slightly. "Several, actually." Karoline nodded. "And do you have a PR team?" Crawford frowned slightly. "Of course. And when they speak to the press on your behalf, does that mean you don't make decisions?" His smirk faltered. She didn't look away. She didn't blink. "That's the thing about press secretaries, Mr. Crawford," she continued smoothly. "We don't just read words on a page. We have to navigate complex issues, de-escalate crises, and ensure the entire country understands the administration's position, all while standing in front of the most hostile press corps in the world." She paused, letting the words settle. Crawford opened his mouth, but nothing came out. Karoline smiled lightly. "But you're right. Not difficult at all." The way she said it, calm, effortless, devastating. Crawford clenched his jaw, looking away. A passenger across the aisle snorted, trying to hold in laughter. Karoline simply turned back toward her tray table, as if the conversation had never happened. The flight took off, and for a while Crawford stayed silent, but his ego wouldn't let it go. He cleared his throat. "So, what's next for you?" Karoline didn't even blink. "What do you mean?" Crawford shrugged. "Come on, we both know you won't be press secretary forever. What's next? You running for office?" His tone was mocking, but there was something else underneath it now. Curiosity, respect maybe? Karoline simply smiled, folding her hands in her lap. "I suppose we'll find out, won't we?" The answer was deliberately vague, But the way she said it, with complete confidence, made Crawford realize something. She wasn't just another press secretary. She was going places. And now he was just another forgettable footnote in her career. For the rest of the flight, Crawford barely spoke. By the time they landed, he was one of the first people off the plane. And Karoline, she took her time, unbothered, walking through the terminal with the quiet confidence of someone who had already won. Because she had. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that inspire and challenge us to grow. What would you have done if you were in her shoes? Let us know in the comments below.